we have an amazing panel and a very big issue. And so I want to, my job as moderator is just to try and focus us more on local strategies where we can make a difference, sort of next steps, but understanding the broader context to be able to be effective local advocates for decarceration. And so I'll just quickly introduce our esteemed panelists tonight. Starting at the opposite end of the table there, Janie Osejo is the Peer Support Program Coordinator and Journey Home Reentry Bilingual Resource Specialist at Madison Area Urban Ministry. And woo. Indeed. And Adams is a Co-Executive Director of Freedom Inc., which works to inspire and restore power to those most affected by violence. Also involved in policy development with Movement for Black Lives, and co-authored a Wisconsin Law Review article on Black community control over the police. Heidi and her associate Link, Heidi Leugleiter, is an amazing Dane County Board Supervisor representing District 2. She led opposition to the $227 million new jail that unfortunately passed this spring, but that's not the end of the story, and that's why we're here tonight, to strategize what we can still do to decarcerate. And we'll hear from Heidi about policy at the county level, and she's also a public interest attorney representing low-income tenants in eviction cases, and is the policy committee chair of Progressive Dane. And then Pam Oliver, UW-Madison sociology professor, whose areas of expertise include racial disparities in criminal justice, with a focus on Wisconsin, as well as social justice movements and police repression of them, such as the Black Lives Matter movement. And she served on multiple commissions around racial disparities in criminal justice at the state and county levels. And so, welcome and join the discussion. We're going to start with a go around of the panelists, asking them to start at the end, which is at the end of our discussion tonight. What do you think is the one most important thing for people to leave here knowing or being mindful of to be able to be effective advocates for decarceration at the local level? Jamie, do you want to go?
Sure. I think for me is that we can talk about de-incarceration all we want. So whether we don't incarcerate at all, whether we offer alternatives to maybe being sentenced or incarcerated, to keep in mind that we can reduce the population of people involved in the criminal justice system, but as long as we don't have resources put in place and support services, mental health, substance use, affordable housing, it's not going to really change much. People are really suffering in many ways, and incarceration sometimes is just a piece of it. So that's kind of what I want people to understand, that it's not as easy as let's let everybody go. There's nowhere for them to go. There's not enough resources, that sort of stuff. And also, what are we really doing on the preventive side of it? You know, when you're starting to criminalize poverty with, decisions that are based on surviving are being criminalized, that sort of stuff. You know, what's really going on, and why is it fair help for everybody, not just a few.
Okay, thank you. I would say that that us as a movement have to understand, historically and scientifically, there has been no social change and no fundamental social change without a social movement. And social movements have been successful because they have scientifically approached the question, to put it crudely, is how do we force those in power to concede? How do we force those in power to give us what we want? Which in many ways then requires disruption. And so we live in Madison, which is described as a liberal beacon of hope, which very much is a liberal veneer. And so oftentimes we think the way to create change is by story gathering or moral appeals. I do think story collection is incredibly important. I do think we should listen to those most impacted, and I do think we should share that information. That as a strategy to force capitalists to make money, who build power, to make a change in behavior for people who they can frankly care less about is not an effective strategy. So though I care about moral appeals, I think they're best for people that we want to join our organization to understand why it matters, how it matters, and to be invested in the vision and alternative. But our method to fighting this injustice of an extension of chattel enslavement cannot be just by having coffee and lunch. And so if anything, I want people to leave with a serious commitment to disruption and not just to appeals.
Right on. I think that we have gross overinvestment in the police state here locally. I think we have, when we look at where our local tax dollars go, and we look where increases in the city budget and in the county budget have occurred over time, and the number of employees and the money that we have that's flexible, that's based on our local revenue, the money for the sheriff's department and incarceration and policing goes up. The money for human services, for health care, for housing, for youth services in the community has gone down. And that is not who we think we are as a community, as Em was saying. And I don't think that's widely understood. And we really do need that kind of movement to force that change, to redirect those resources where they belong in the community, where people are free and can really, exercise their potential.
I'm not sure what I'm going to say. I guess I'll find out. Some of you know I've been trying to do work in this area for going on 20 years now, and lately I've been trying to figure out whether I actually accomplished anything at all. Sometimes I think not. So I'm sort of in this depressive state. But first I agree with Em, actually, that disruption is really important. My own personal role hasn't been disruptive. My personal role has been in like statistics and education. And so I do think that it's important to think about division of labor among different people with their talents and skills, and be looking for ways to work together to reinforce each other in the different directions. I do actually believe in the value of data because a thing I've learned is that it's a moving target. So when I started this game, like mass incarceration was still going. Mass incarceration was already beginning to have the forces of declining by the time I started paying attention. At this point, right-wingers are against too much prison because it gets really expensive. I mean, so that's moved around. And so now a lot of the criminal justice action is, in prison is still really important, but community corrections and ankle bracelets and a lot of other ways of surveilling people and monitoring people and hassling people have become more and more important. And so one of the things is you work on one part of the system, but then another part takes off, right? And so it keeps changing where the action is. So I do think it's important for people who care, for us all to be learning about. It's hard, it's really complicated. People in the system actually don't understand it, but to try to get your head around all the different parts of the system and what's happening over here, what's happening over here, and how you can kind of pound over here and get some progress over here, but then it might slide over there. So really trying to pay attention to all the different ways it can work. And also, so things change over time, and also things are really different in different places. So just because something was happening in New York doesn't mean it's what's happening here, or what was happening in Milwaukee isn't necessarily what's happening here. You really need to understand your own local place. So the steps to pay attention to are kind of in order, like all the social conditions that create difficulties for folks, arrest and the surveillance patterns, prosecution and charging decisions, the whole plea bargaining process, the whole way that pretrial detention is playing into the plea bargaining process, what's going on with the bail, what's going on with, a new source of thing that people are paying attention to is fines and fees, and the ways that court costs are just devastating for people. You know, people are out in the community, but they're being given these huge bills. So it's a really complicated way of saying, I think that for me, the hard thing, and I think but for all of us the hard thing, is not to oversimplify and get it down, think that like a 10-word slogan is everything, but to not lose the vision of being willing to keep pushing. You know, it's easy to say, oh, it's complex, I'm gonna go home and like have a nap. You know, to be willing to keep working at the same time as you're willing to not oversimplify, and that's it.
Great, thank you. You'll definitely not be simplifying tonight. So I want to start to pick apart some of the parts of this huge repressive system and start at police policies and practices, and with a question directed towards Em, and then invite other people to jump in if they want. But can you talk about community control over police and how that would change what we're talking about? What does community control over police mean, and how does that address the over-incarceration that we have?
Okay. So I'll read a definition or a framing of community control of police that we offered in the paper, and then I'll explain it a little bit. So community control of the police, democratic community control over the organs of the state, granted the consent of the governed to carry arms, deny people their freedom, and even kill through the exercise of the state monopoly on violence. From a visionary standpoint, it ultimately is to self-determine what is and how to do safety in our community. So currently, the state has a monopoly on violence, meaning the state has the right to enact violence in a variety of forms, and the state is the only being structure that is supposed to be able to do it. So right now, if a police officer, I say the police officer murdered Tony Robinson, but the state says that the police officer didn't. The state says that Tony Robinson was killed. Because the state has the right to a monopoly of violence. The state is backed by law, by custom, by culture, by wealth, infrastructure, and a bunch of other things that gives it the authority to enact and carry out violence. So the state can have a military, the state can have a police department, the state can assign people the job of incarcerating people in cages. The state can create laws that say if you don't do what I tell you to do, you'll go into a cage. The state actually has those powers. And the state is supposed to be the only being, the only structure with those powers. And so while thinking about how to end the community control of the police, we proposed a solution to specifically deal with the murders of Black people by the police. Because the fundamental thing that we identified is the state had the power to act out violence, and we didn't have any power to say whether or not they should or shouldn't, or any power to actually stop them. So even with a wealth of knowledge and information, videos, footage, witnesses, plain day sight, right there, everybody knows it, we still didn't have any power to actually do anything about it. And so while we saw campaigns around divestment from policing being important, taking away some of the resources in which the police have or the state has to kill and harm, we also knew that we had to directly wrestle with the political control of the state. So even if we were fighting to sort of limit their budgets, we still had to directly wrestle with the right of the state to do what it was doing. And so that's what the fundamental question is at hand of community control. It says who actually has the right, one, to determine safety, and then two, build out infrastructures to deal with the questions of safety and harm in our communities. And so community control of the police, in a pragmatic way, proposed this. I proposed that we district up a locale, so right now we're in Madison. We would district up Madison based on real socio-political geographic borders. So for example, there exists a South Side that lives and acts and operates very differently than when you pass Fish Hatchery going north, right? The way that community is seen, the way that community is treated, who lives there, who has access, et cetera. So we would take that seriously into consideration when considering what is a community. Once these new community lines for district are drawn, they would then take the same resources that are currently going, that Heidi was describing, that are currently going to the policing department. So whatever hundreds of millions of dollars that is, would be district up, same way according to that. So if currently the south side of Madison, I don't know if this number is true or not, but let's just say the south side of Madison is the most, has the most resources spent on it to police, they would get the most resources in this instant spent on developing whatever the alternative was. We would take it to a vote, these particular districts, they would vote whether or not they wanted the police, this current existing model of policing. And if they don't want it, they get to build a new safety apparatus. They can call it whatever they want. I mean, I'm using the word police because we know police as we understand it, but effectively they build a new security safety apparatus. And they would have the power to determine, real community members in these districts would have the power to determine the policy, practices, and procedures of this new safety apparatus. So currently with policing, right now here at the library, if there was a homeless person outside and they urinated because they don't have a place to go and they urinated on what's considered the state's property as public property, the police would come and they would say this person violated the law, whatever social contract, and they should be locked up for doing so. We think that if actual people, real people who lived in these areas, lived in these communities, had the power to determine what happened, that instead our new safety apparatus could come up and interact and say, actually the harm here is that this person doesn't have a place to go. And that we are more concerned not with the brick that will be dry when the sun comes back up, but we are more concerned with the wellness of this person. And so community control offers us the opportunity, one, to have actual resource, to put into practice some of the things that we're talking about, right? To take over this budget used currently for policing and causing harm and death, to take over those budgets and actually build real security and safety apparatuses in our community that meet our real needs, that give the people who live there the actual power to decide it, and not some person removed from a distance. So if that were true, we would radically change the perception of criminality, quite possibly. We would radically change the amount of folks incarcerated. And again, it's not a panacea. We still have to change the other aspects of the criminal justice system to completely eradicate some of the ills we're talking about. But we think we would radically change the current outcomes and the current issues we're experiencing as a result of the existing policing structures. So that's it. Oh, that's what I'm saying.
Excellent, thank you.
Sure.
Does anyone else want to add to that? And again, we're kind of thinking locally, thinking different parts of this very complex system. So Pam, can you talk a little bit about what leads up to trial and how that, once somebody is arrested, how they can be part of the jail population?
I'll try. I was on a committee trying to figure this out. Even the more people studied it, the more confused we got sometimes. So sometimes when you get stopped by the police, you don't actually get taken downtown, right? And especially if you're not in the city of Madison, you're out in one of the suburbs, you may get a ticket and not go downtown, right? So, but some people get physically taken into custody, brought downtown. One of the things that I learned when I was on the jail committee, the Constitution of the state of Wisconsin guarantees the right to bail. And what's interesting is that the right to bail is in one sense a liberatory aspect, because it means that you cannot be forced, if you have the right to get out before you've been found guilty by posting bail. Now the problem is, so what that means is you have to have the money to post the bail and exercise that right. So the same basic facts, if you are a person who can afford, and in this community, one of the things we don't have is bail bonds. So the bails here are actually generally relatively low as these things go. They're typically not $50,000, they're typically like 500 or 1,000 or something. So if you're a person of means, the bail is actually affordable, you can get out. But if you don't have the money, you can't get out, right? So that's the first thing. So there are a lot of debate, but I think it is important to remember that it's the bail law was originally written as the right to get out. But then it becomes a barrier to getting out if you don't have the money. So there's been a lot of discussion about people should just be out on signature bond, that's what it's called, is not have to post money, just be out. So, but that's one of the issues, is that some people are detained pretrial, and the reason this matters is about somewhere between 97 and 99% of all cases are plea bargained. Very few cases go to trial. That's how the system works. Everybody who's in the system knows that, but people who aren't in the system sometimes are shocked. So plea bargaining is really what's happening. And if you're in custody pre-trial, the only way to get out is to plead guilty, because it's a couple of years to go to trial. So you are being punished while you're waiting to go to trial. Whereas if you are out on bail, then you have a lot more leverage. You can say to the DA, take me to trial. I'm willing to wait because you're out, right? So this pre-trial detention is really, really crucial. We've had lots of discussions in this community trying to count how many people are actually in jail because of not having money. And it's harder to count than you would imagine. What I understand from the people who are trying to figure it out is that that is not most of who is in jail. And I'll talk next about most of who's in jail, but some people who are in jail, that's what they're in for. And there are people trying to do bail funds to get people out, to raise money, to get money for people's bail. But notice that another approach is to say you shouldn't have cash bail. Or another way to think about it is to think in terms of day wage. So there's some European countries in which it could be $1 million for a traffic ticket. And the reason is they calculate the fines and fees on the basis of a percentage of how much money you make. So they basically figure out how much, what your daily wage is, and then they'll say, they might set your bail as a percentage of, so if you make nothing, then I guess your bail would be nothing, right? But so if you're really rich, you'd have to pay a high bail if you're poor. So you could think that way is that a more equitable way to think about the bail process, the right to get out, is to think of it in terms of percentage of income. The people, when they keep poor people in, they say, well, you'd be a flight risk because you don't have any money at stake, you don't have a place to live, therefore you would go away, as if it's easy for you to get away when you okay, so that's bad. A big reason some people are in jail because they've been sentenced to jail. And a big group of people are in jail because they are on supervision, probation or parole, or extended supervision, they're in community supervision, and the reason they're in jail is that they are on a hold, where their probation or parole officer has incarcerated them temporarily for some reason. Sometimes it's a sanction, it's a punishment in itself, like you're not behaving yourself on supervision, so we're going to lock you up for 10 days to get your attention. There's some people who, there's actually a law that requires that if somebody calls up the PO and says this person threatened me with violence, the PO is required to incarcerate them. So some people are incarcerated because somebody accused them of threatening violence. We think, but we're not sure, but we think that in this community, if you're on paper and you're accused of a new crime, you are routinely put on hold. So that it's just assumed essentially that you're guilty of the new crime. So even though you haven't been adjudicated for it, you're sitting there on a hold. So even if the judge is willing to bail you out, you can't bail out because your PO is not letting you out. So that's a lot of what's going on. Some other things to know, somebody just told me they've been trying to crunch the numbers on this, that one of the Moses people's been trying to get these numbers. Apparently, according to him, a lot of the people who are being counted as part of the jail tally are actually out on ankle bracelets. So that's another thing. Now the ankle bracelet is a way to get out and be supervised. The problem is you have to pay for it, right? So I guess it varies. They have various rules, but people are being charged for the expenses of supervising them, so that's just another thing to pay attention to. So I'm not sure if I answered all of this, but there's just a lot of stuff going on, and honestly, the more I find out, the more I realize there's more to figure out about just who's in jail, where they are, why they are, and how to try to map the statistics with what's going on.
Any other thoughts on that? All right. So I'm going to go to Janie next and ask us, as a reentry specialist, can you talk about what are the common big challenges? I mean, we've heard so many, but I'm sure that there are more that you routinely come into. And actually, before the panel, you were talking a little bit about specifically women and how the challenges that they face are a little bit different, and they're the largest growing part, right, of the population.
So we're just talking about the jail population. There is a continual cycle of women that are just going in and out of the system. And it's sad. So on one hand, we're seeing that, yeah, they're not being sent to prison. Their sentence might be less, but they're ending up in the jail system. So we've done some work on getting the sentence reduced or not, and they're on P-holds, or they're, they made some other arrangements, or they pled. And so they have, they're in jail. That's great. But what happens is, because they're coming out, there's not enough resources. So what I'm talking about is somebody coming out is dealing with, they may have had, while they were incarcerated, they lost if you get picked up, even if you just get picked up, we're not even talking about new charges. If you get picked up because there's a allegation, or maybe you were arrested, you had housing, you could have lost it, depending on how long you were in there. Women have, in fact, lost their children because they were just picked up, lost. I was explaining that I was working with a woman that it was her and her boyfriend, they were not married, they had children. She wound up being in jail for whatever reason. He was a caretaker, everything was fine. He got arrested on a traffic violation and got picked up and got to jail, and he said, my children are gonna go home to nobody there. CPS got involved. Now you have two parents in jail who there was no necessary child neglect, but now CPS is involved. And so these are the layers that are just adding. So now she's come out, she's trying, she connected to our services. We're trying to work with her. We were able to put her in transitional living program in the meantime. And this whole time she's now dealing with child protectors, of Chip's case. And the boyfriend is still incarcerated for whatever reason, and not too long ago she lost those two children. And one was because she just didn't make it in time to get her own housing, meet those demands that they requested for the Chips case, and she understands that. But it's very difficult when that happens. So there's all these multi-layers of women that are falling into a situation where they're coming out. If they were involved in sex trafficking, if they were involved in other situations as part of surviving, they're winding up coming out. There's no housing for people. A lot of people they have gaps in housing, they have been evicted, they may have sought services that helped them at one time, and then, for many reasons, they're now not able to get services through those programs anymore. And so they're winding up making decisions to survive. So they might be winding up back with whoever was sex trafficking them, whoever looks good to them, whoever is saying, hey, you could stay with me, friends and all that. And they're winding up then making choices. They're winding up dealing with, or not dealing with the trauma that is continuing happening to them. And then sometimes they fall back into relapsing, whether they're not back on their meds. You're talking about people that are coming out that may have not been on meds in the jail, because the jail has a process of what you get and you don't get in there. You may have been stabled and go into the jail, and you're not getting on the same meds. So there's all these different layers that are happening, and then you expect a woman to come out. They no longer have their children. They're making decisions to survive, live somewhere because there's no housing. They can't afford it. They have gaps in employment. And then you wonder why they may have relapsed, why they may have done something to survive. Even if they're living in a hotel, they're doing other things that now we're criminalizing that behavior. And it's all about surviving. And some women, that has been their life. They've survived this whole time. There's this resilience, and we don't acknowledge that resilience, and we see it as a weakness, and that they're just committing crime after crime. Why are they doing that? I was working with a woman that, you look at all her charges, all retail theft. All retail theft. When you actually ask her what's going on, she's stealing food, clothing for her children. That is what it's about. At some point, they put her in for a year. Luckily, she had a husband who was out that could take care of the children. But in her eyes, it's like she's coming out and she still didn't get any services. She talked about not getting what she needs. No one has really dealt with why is she doing all these thefts? Why is she really stealing food? All these things. Yes, there's food pantries. There's a lot of resources in that way. It's just layered. So that's like when you're working with women like we do at MOM, and I case manage a lot of the women, that is what we see, this continual cycle of women coming in and out, arrest after arrest after arrest. And it's all based on surviving. And we still keep seeing that as a failure of them not really addressing those needs. So women are trying to get clean. Some of them, and I'm going to say it based on their color, have access to services. Some of them don't. Some of them are getting information about resources while they're in jail. Some of them do not have the same access. So at MOM, what we see is, we get some referrals and we don't get some referrals. Why aren't everybody being referred, whether it's to us or other agencies? Why are they being connected the same way? The jail is trying to talk about doing reentry and coordination. And it's just, it's slowly getting there, but there's gaps, and we haven't figured those out, so getting numbers is difficult. For men, there's complication there, there's a lot of stuff going on that's similar, but for men, it's actually, I don't want to say it's easier, but it's just there's housing, there's a lot more services. I keep hearing, when I bring up the issue of why aren't there more programs and why are we putting more money into services for women, I keep hearing, well, there's a lot more men incarcerated, there's a lot more this and this. Yeah, but at some point, we gotta understand that women are dealing with a whole other set of layers. Men are also now starting to start to address the issues of childhood trauma, starting to talk about things that are affecting Black men and brown communities, and so there's just a lot of layers. I put on here just lack of resources on who's getting mental health and substance use. That new money that came from the county, that they're putting towards mental health and substance use. Who's going to access those? I see a lot of clients that are people of color that are not accessing Journey Mental Health. They're not getting into tutorial. They're not getting into all these medically assisted treatment programs. They're not getting on the Vivitrol shot. They're not being offered the same services. And why is that happening? And it's just a whole bunch of things that I think we've all talked about. But for me, that's what we see. It's also challenging when, so employment's great, but if everybody's dealing with mental health or substance use, and now they're UAing for everybody, to get food stamps now, if you've got a drug charge or anything, they want to UA you also just to get food stamps, and if you're not willing to do that, you're off. If you've sanctioned yourself or not eligible now for food stamps or benefits, you're not eligible for 3 years. It's not a short time. You're done for 3 years. What are people supposed to do? Some people don't want to go through all those hoops, so they don't go on food stamps. They don't access benefits that they deserve to be on. So it's just a variety of things that just layers and layers, and I'm not even touching probably everything. So, it's just a lot of things.
Maybe anybody want to add to that, re-entry barriers for women accessing to services? I mean,
Yeah, you did
excellent. So Heidi, you've been working very hard to develop and to build support at the county board level around policies to decarcerate. What does this look like? What steps do we need to take? Can you talk about a little bit about that, what you're working on, but then also what are the things that you're finding resistance from your fellow board members on? And so that we
Well, that's
can.
easy to answer. No.
Yeah. Hopefully not all of the above, but just to say, like, what do we need to build support for, right, in particular?
Thanks for the question. So, at the time of the, the jail vote, double the price jail vote, the surprise, we can't build on top, we need to spend twice as much money on a new jail vote. That came through the process very quickly, and it was challenging to try to coordinate and line up votes and, have a $1 million consultant plan to propose an alternative to what essentially the county executive and the county board chair had already said we were going to do, announced that we were going to do. Well, there's really no other option. And so, well, I thought at least somebody's got to put out some other option. What would a different plan look like? And so, we held a couple public meetings at the Hawthorne Library to get some input on if the community was gonna put out an alternative, what would we want that plan to be? Instead of investing all this money in a new jail, can we plan something else? Can we plan investments in the community? And also, take some money to address the most imminent life and safety threats in the old city-county building. Because there were some serious conditions there that a lot of us agreed, I think everyone agreed were unacceptable. But the amount of money that was proposed for this jail was just not right, and I felt like a waste of resources and a waste of human potential for locking people up in this way. So I drafted a resolution that I introduced the same night that we all kind of expected the jail vote to pass, or the jail plan to pass, which it did pass. But that plan did a few, had some goals in it, and some of those things I want to mention now. And one of the things that I didn't think would be very controversial or get much pushback is what I have been stumbling over in trying to move this resolution forward. So when this resolution was introduced, 4 people signed on to it, the same 4 people that voted against the jail that night. We need 19 people to pass a resolution like this. So we're short some votes. This resolution is still in committee, and I'm trying to find a way where we can get something with enough votes to get movement on a decarceration plan. So what I was trying to do is review all the recommendations that came out of the working groups that came out of the resolution 556 during the kind of first round of pushback against the jail, when the community spoke up and the plan didn't move forward. Instead, there was this long resolution that resulted in 3 groups making recommendations, and Pam referred to her work, I think, on the Lake of State Committee in that process. And so one of the recommendations from the State Committee was to actually add 5 new voting members to the Justice Council, and that those persons would have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system, one of whom was a person of color previously incarcerated, and 2 people with expertise in behavioral health. This is a recommendation right from the committee that we've already accepted, And I was like, and the rationale behind it was, these are people who have urgency about this issue. These are people who have been most impacted, and they will kind of hold our feet to the fire. They will hold us accountable in a way. This council right now, has all these elected officials, constitutional officers, the sheriff, the county executive, there's non-voting and voting members, but a lot of people, the district attorney, that if they wanted to make change, have a lot of power to make change. So there's a lot of potential on this council, and the idea was, well, we have all these recommendations. We really need people at the table to make these recommendations happen, okay? So I was like, well, how do they say no to that? That seems like a pretty straightforward idea. It's already been recommended to us. Well, they kind of did. When I went to present this resolution and talk to the Criminal Justice Council about it, there were kind of a lot of concerns. Well, this is really complicated. We have voting and non-voting members, and I'm not sure about that. And they didn't actually say no at this point, but I'm getting kind of through other channels this pushback, which is, that's not going to happen. Why don't you think about putting people on a subcommittee to the Criminal Justice Council, community people on the subcommittee to the Criminal Justice Council, and maybe you could have some more non-voting members on the Criminal Justice Council. So that I didn't expect pushback on, but I am getting some pushback on. And I think part of it is that I thought we should charge and really have the Criminal Justice Council develop this decarceration plan, because there's people at the table who actually, if pressured and convinced and decided to do something, could do something. It's not just another group that can make a recommendation to them to do something, okay? So in my sense, I was like, well, this should be their responsibility, and we should ask them to do it. We should tell them what we want them to wrestle with and decide on and try to implement. And if they don't, then we will all know that they don't care, and we will hold their feet to the fire, and they will be accountable for saying, we don't want to do something like that. And they might get voted out of office. I don't know, but that was kind of the idea, that this is really something that should sit at this place, because the people with the power to make these decisions and change systems on that level sit there. So I've gotten some feedback that maybe we don't go through the Criminal Justice Council, because probably maybe they don't want to do this at all, it's too hard, or they want to do things on their own terms on a really slow pace, and maybe we should just develop a different task force with the people that we want on it, that are on our side, that want to decarcerate, and they can make a recommendation to the county board. So that's one of the conversations about implementation that's happening. Where I have received some positive feedback is this understanding that the jail population doesn't magically reduce itself. In a growing community like Dane County, and with all of these other unmet needs in the community for people re-entering, we can't just expect that all the people are going to fit in the so-called smaller and safer jail that's being planned if we don't actually have strategies and resources dedicated to supporting people in the community. The type of resources that Jeannie mentioned were lacking are the things that we need in the community to make sure people aren't coming to jail. And so a big focus of my resolution was to make a plan to get the money to create housing and the money to have access to adequate behavioral mental health care and treatment for addiction and crisis stabilization services. So the plan that the resolution that I introduced, Resolution 67, was to reduce in 5 years the number of people incarcerated in Dane County Jail by 350 people. Okay, 350, right?
Yeah.
And in the same 5 years, create 350 supportive housing units in the community. Okay, so we need to do that to do the other, I think, because otherwise it's not going to work. And that's not all we're going to do, but that is a huge piece. I think, you mentioned housing a bunch of times, right? And so that piece and understanding what that costs is critical to being able to move forward, I think. And then there's a lot of other recommendations that we've received from work groups, that we've received from the consultants that we've hired, our academic partners at Harvard, and the Arnold Foundation folks, and the Pretrial Justice Institute, and all these experts that come talk to us. We've received lots of recommendations and feedback, okay? And so there's other things that we need to be looking at, but I think what I really want to know from the people who provide services, the people who are working with people in the community who don't have the services, is how much will it cost to create these housing units? How much will it cost to create one or more culturally relevant, community-based crisis and resource centers to provide an alternative to incarceration when people are experiencing a mental wellness crisis? And how do we review the policies of all our diversion and alternative programs, including the community restorative court, including our treatment courts, including the diversion and first-time offenders program? How are we reviewing all these to make sure that they're equitable and to make sure all the different rules that, all the supervision, all the surveillance, all the monitoring is, does that even make sense? And is it fair? And is it a best practice? All of that needs to be taken apart. And so this is what I want us to spend a year of planning effort on. I want us to have money to develop a plan, staff support. I want us to have benchmarks and deadlines for getting this plan done. And then I think we should have a 5-year plan to dramatically reduce our jail population and create this supportive housing in the community. So I do think there's a recognition that these things are needed. We need to develop the will to understand how much money we need and to probably go to the voters with a referendum to give us the power to say, raise the levy, raise our taxes because we care about people and human rights, and in order to keep people out of jail, they need housing and health care. And if the federal government's not going to do it, and the state government's not going to do it, we're going to step up and do it ourselves. And right now, we need to, like I said, kind of reduce the amount going into incarceration, but we also, that's going to take some time. That's going to take some time to find those savings from reducing the number of deputies that we need because our jail population is lowered. So we are going to need, I think, an infusion of resources to create this number of permanent supportive housing units. And we need to be able to raise the levy. And the only way we can do that is with, under current law, is to win a referendum with the voters. But before we get there, we need to know what we want to ask the voters for and what that will get us. So that's kind of what my idea is for how, there's all sorts of things we need to do, but that's what my idea is policy-wise in terms of trying to get the money we need to support people in the community.
Excellent, thank you. Go for it.
So along with just getting support services and whether, how to sell it to vote, but part of it is also, I don't know, I struggle with this because it's how do we even educate the voters, right? Because I keep seeing this, not in my backyard. Oh, I want to do that, but yeah, not, the reality is we have people with crimes, people don't want to be around people. I remember living in a neighborhood near when Safe Haven was coming out over by Nakoma, and the outrage that some community members in that neighborhood, were just expressing, and it was very difficult to live there because of some of the comments, and these are people that saw themselves as being progressive and liberal, and oh yeah, I think they need a place to stay, but not near me, because oh my goodness, now they're dealing with mental health, and do you know what that happens? And the comment, and we keep seeing that, right? Salvation Army is trying to rebuild down here, and what we're seeing coming out, it's the reality. When the Beacon was opening, all that controversy, the reality is that we are still in a city, in a county that does not really support some of these support services and don't want to deal. We had a mayor who didn't want homeless people here. I mean, it was, ship them off. We have, So that's the reality. We need to keep talking about that, because that's who's coming out to vote. You know, those are the people that, when we think we're gonna win, and then we see the votes and we're like, what happened? We had this big push, we had this big movement, and then we get this resistance. So, I mean, I just want to keep that in the forefront, that that is who we're dealing with in Madison, and we can't hide that. Some of us have our own biases, some of them are just misunderstandings, some of it is fear. You know, when you hear the word sex offender, when you hear about people that were in jail, there's always this stigma attached. And so we can have all of this, but it just keeps going. It's like, at some point, we gotta realize that everybody is a human being, they deserve basic rights, and at some point, you also will never know if you ever find yourself in that situation. And so we have a very difficult time thinking that way, even though we don't want to admit it. And I've had some people that were close to me that say, oh, it's great, I think it's great what you guys want to do with Mom and all this stuff, and, oh, but sex offenders, and they'll just go the other way, and it's like, oh, okay, so, but that's the reality, right? So I just want to keep that always in the forefront, that's what we're dealing with in Madison, even though we don't want to talk about it.
So I was thinking, if you don't mind,
No, I just.
because I was sort of thinking about a related issue listening to Ann earlier. You know, I'm more on the affluent end of the community, right? So I talk to affluent people, and one problem with us affluent folks is we like to buy ourselves out of other people's pain. You know, and so a lot of what's happening is the folks who can are trying to voluntarily separate from the folks with troubles, and then as there's growing inequality, right, it becomes getting worse. So it's a political problem. It's exactly a political problem. It's a social movement problem. It's a politician problem. It's a voting problem. And I don't think it's, so one model says, oh, these people have these really fixed interests, right? There's us and them. And I do believe in the importance, I'm not trying to argue against the importance of disruptive protest, but I'm going to complicate it a little bit. Because what does happen, you could sort of see it with Black Lives Matter and then the rise of white nationalism, right? There are these, there's a tendency sometimes to polarization and people separating, and what you're hoping to do, you're not going to win everybody, but you're trying to win the middle. And I'm not necessarily arguing for, I mean, that is often used as an argument for moderate politics, and I'm not necessarily going there, but I am going there about the political problem of educating and also persuading, trying to pull folks over, because this community, the votes are predominantly white, the votes are predominantly affluent, and the question is how to get more of the votes. I mean, I personally, I'm there, like, please take money away from me in taxes so I don't have to feel personal guilt about social problems. I mean, I'm willing to go there. I mean, that's going to be sort of a stupid political analysis, but you know, taxes are a way of like bringing the situation back and sort of socializing it. So I don't have answers, but I think that's the political problem, is to both have enough pressure, but then also be trying to get enough votes, get enough support to get people not to resist you, but to join the side, right? And it's hard. And I guess that's why I feel like it has to be a kind of multifaceted political program where some folks are working here and some folks are working here, but knowing what each other's doing, trying to build a big enough coalition to win.
Be like a local progressive third party.
Honestly, I'm not advocating any particular plan, because I really don't feel like I personally know what to do. I'm waiting for leadership from other people. But so I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just sort of saying I think that that's kind of where the problem is that how to win, where you realize that one thing that happens is you get opposition, right? The other side is also trying to figure out how they can win, and so you're trying to. The strategic problem is it's not like if you just do it not like if you have the perfect strategy, you're guaranteed to win. The other side is trying to figure out how they can have their strategy to win. And so you're trying to work strategically and interactively, and it's, that's what the political problem is. That's what the social movement problem is. Strategic.
So I want to do two things, so I'll do them both because I'm the moderator. And, and one is to just bring up, as we're talking about decarceration, that, and this might be stating the obvious, but there was an analysis that the Sentencing Project did last year of 5 US states that have been relatively successful in their decarceration, by which it's 14 to 25% reductions in their incarcerated population. And looking at what lessons can we learn from their successes and the shortfalls. And one of the things was just reducing the numbers doesn't necessarily reduce the racial inequality in those numbers, right? So I want to put that out there as a part of building a strong social justice decarceration movement, number one, in the area with the worst racial disparities in incarceration. And then the other thing that I want to do is welcome all the folks not on the panel into the discussion. And so knowing that there's a lot of expertise in the room. So I'll just, maybe that was the first audience question, was my part about racial disparities, but are there other questions that people want to, or comments that people want to
Do you
make?
mind if I just complicate this a little? This is going to be a professor in me, I'm sorry, but when you're thinking about the racial disparities, there's kind of 3 ways to think about it. The racial disparity index mathematically is most influenced by the denominator, the whites. So places that don't lock up very many whites have higher disparity indexes than places that lock up more whites. Then there's the rate at which people of color are being locked up. And so it's mathematically quite possible to reduce how many black people are being locked up, to materially reduce incarceration of black people while you're reducing incarceration of white people and have the disparity go up, right? Because and so I guess I've always kind of felt myself that the most important number is the rate of incarceration of minorities, like how many black people are being locked up or how many Native people are being locked up, more than just the disparity ratio. But the disparity ratio does point to possible inequities in how the system is working. And so I always try to keep track of all the moving parts, but I just wanted to say that. I mean, what actually did happen nationally is that black rates of imprisonment actually started falling while white rates of imprisonment were still going up. And what was happening actually is that incarceration was falling in big cities while it was still going up in rural areas where white people lived. And anyway, as I said, that's why I'm saying it's a moving target. There's still tons of racial disparities in the system. We were talking before about specific instances of racial inequities that we've all seen, where you do see the situation where 2 people did basically the same thing and the person of color just gets treated worse. I mean, that happens a lot. So I'm not by any means denying the racial element of it. But I'm particularly concerned about bringing down the rates for everybody paying attention to minorities. So you don't want a system that brings down the rates for whites but leaves them high for minorities. That I don't want. But my own action would be trying to make sure the Black, Latinx, Native rates are coming down.
Audience, questions, comments?
Yeah, I'm listening here, and I've got comments, some that were probably racial thinking, but it seems to me one thing, if you equal the amount of money you spend on the security and the police with the amount you spend to help these people so they don't get incarcerated, you get an equality there that basically says if we spend so much money on the police, we have to spend the same amount on people not to keep them out of the system. And one of the things there would be, then there seems to be a balance you would eventually get. Well, you may not get that, but the point is, the first thing you have to say is we want to spend the money equally. You got an equal pot, half of it if you're going to put it in prisons, the other half has to go to keeping people out of prisons and for the community to take care of them and so forth.
I'd like to spend like 90% on keeping people out.
And you could do a lot more, right, with a dollar that goes towards prevention that goes towards incarceration.
Incarceration is really, really expensive. You could house somebody out of prison for the same price as you can house them in prison.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah,
With a much better
we'll go to
with a
Honey.
much better quality of life, yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to clarify about the 350 bail fund. We don't just seek to sort of raise bail and bail people out. We also have like base building as part of our project, something that we're working on, getting better at, as far as like the fact that we're in front of folks who are sort of most impacted by incarceration, getting those folks, participating or getting their input on ways that we can get rid of cash bail, decarcerate Dean in various ways. And then also, just wanted to point out, I was Tuesday, that's yesterday, with my son, I was at Tony Evers' event, because basically he promised to reduce the prison population by 50% as one of his as one of his campaign promises, and of course hasn't acted on that at all, which is pretty status quo for any election campaign in my opinion. And so we went there to try to put pressure on him, particularly for the Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility. I was with some folks from the closed Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility, and at the time we were doing that, they said that they were actually, these folks were also organizing with people in Milwaukee, Liberate Milwaukee, which is a group that formed to try to reduce the police budget over there, and they put pressure on Mayor Barrett, and they were actually successful, although not as much as they wanted to. They wanted to, Mayor Barrett in Milwaukee to reduce the police budget by $25 million. They ended up getting him to reduce it by $500,000, which is like 1/50th of their goal, but I think it was pretty significant nonetheless. And they didn't I kind of have like reservations about not increasing like tax as a way to achieve the goal, just because that's sort of both sides I think are against that. Everyone's against taxes, and I think that they have a good model, right, where they didn't do that. Of course they did raise money. It wasn't through levying taxes. There's some grassroots organizations. The African American Roundtable was the one that sort of led the charge, and there was like 14 different groups, or dozens of different groups that were involved. And basically they did like a survey, and they surveyed like 1,100 people in the community, and they did a lot of research about the police budget and like how it leads to disparities, and also like compared it to other police budgets around the country. And they came up with these things that I believe led to the success in getting $500,000 reduced from the police budget. This just happened yesterday, by the way. Fund community-based violence prevention programs. So they said take $25 million away and put it all into these diversion programs, if you will. I don't know if that's the right name. And then the second one was fund sustainable jobs for young people between 16 to 24 years old, and then fund affordable quality housing. And I believe I heard that it's cheaper to house people outside of prison than it is inside of prison. And then also I just wanted to ask you to clarify, are you saying that like Black Lives Matter led to the rise of white nationalism?
No, white nationalism was already there.
Sure.
No.
So yeah, I think that Liberate Milwaukee is a good thing to look to. Yeah.
I guess I will just respond briefly to the tax question, and I mean, nobody likes to increase, taxes and, that can be.
It's just like, oh, look at that rhetoric.
Can be somewhat, regressive. And there are people who might be priced out of their home if their taxes are raised too much. So that's not something I take lightly. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of ways to raise revenue in Dane County because of the limits that state law has on local government and under the Act 10 that Walker passed. So that's, one of the conundrums we have in terms of trying to find new resources. I absolutely believe that we need to be reducing the sheriff's incarceration budget and the policing budgets and the patrol budgets, but and I would love to see urgency around that, but we really need the pressure and the movement building to make that happen. And so I just don't, I think for this plan to get off the ground, it's hard to think of being able to do that in a way that would create this amount of money, but I'm certainly willing to consider that. I do think that's where we need to go and need to be. I know it's very politically challenging, and so I don't know how fast we can reduce it in order to get the resources we need urgently to keep people out and to get people out. So that's kind of the political balances where we just are really limited in how we can get funds. And so until we can actually divert that significant amount of money from that other system, I haven't found other ways to get it.
I'm gonna speak briefly to, I don't know, how even with decarceration, that there gets to be racial disparities that exist. And I do appreciate the analysis offered by Pam, and I want to add a dimension. So one, I think we have to get, so there is an undercurrent that says people who are currently incarcerated, and there's a logic to it, are incarcerated because of economic issues. So if we begin to solve some of their material needs related to economics, there'd be less people who would go, who in theory would commit crime and then be locked up. So hence, if we were to give people housing, jobs, better education, and a host of other things, which are important, and I think we should do it, I don't think that would solve it either. Because I also think there's an additional undercurrent for Black folks in particular, other folks of color also, but Black folks in particular, where we really have to question what the inherent or fundamental function of the carceral state is. There's no such thing as a universal crime, and there's no such thing as an objective crime, right? Crime is a construct. So if this is Heidi's phone, and Heidi doesn't want anybody taking her phone, if I take this phone, the police could say, oh, you stole it. If Pam takes it, they could come here and say, well, that was a misunderstanding. Pam give it back. There was no crime here, right? So the same exact action took place, objectively speaking. In both instances, Heidi's phone was taken. But in one instant, it was deemed a crime and therefore a punishable act. And now I'm part of the criminal justice the criminal justice system. And another act that was just perhaps a misunderstanding, and there is no socio-political economic consequence to Pam's action by the state. I'm saying that that's more common than not. I think if we look at the crack epidemic juxtaposed to the opioid, there's an opioid, there we, I get to take that, opioid.
Yeah.
And they call it a health crisis.
Yeah.
If we're looking at that juxtaposed to that, we can clearly see how there's no such thing as an objective crime. But relatively speaking, we have the same sort of social issues happening, perhaps at similar scales, devastating communities in similar ways. And in one instance, one is considered criminal. And so the response by the state is to use its monopoly of violence to incarcerate, arrest, put people in under lifelong consequences of felonies, probably even kill some, shoot some, etc., deny people housing, and a host of other violences. And another, the state responds with saying, this is a public health And justice, we need to get our best health thinkers on it and resource it to restore a community, to end a suffering of a community. I'm saying that to say, then I'm arguing that then there's no such thing as an objective crime. So we cannot just try to solve the one undercurrent of incarceration, which is that people are locked up because they're poor. That's absolutely true. That is absolutely a factor without question. I'm not arguing against that. What we have to do also is solve the other undercurrent, which is to say there is an inherently racialized piece that you will not money out of. There's inherently a racialized piece. And, you know, I've argued that race is material, right? Like there is inherently an aspect of the criminal justice system that is race-based, that is set up to be punitive against black people in particular, but all folks of color in general. And so I think unless we approach both, we will end up creating policies and opportunities such as pre-child detention options, such as some of the diversion programs, such as some of these other initiatives that have been developed, and they will apply to white people. Because we have only dealt with one aspect of that, which is the economic issue associated with criminality, but not the inherently race-based, racialized function or definition of criminality and punishment. And so until we do both, we will come to that, to the statement that you made, one way or the other.
Other questions or comments as we're wrapping up here, although we could keep on going. But, yep.
One thing I'd like to say is that I think with regard to the idea of sort of trying to pressure or convince the middle to go in one direction, it seems to me like that speaks to the need for us to address the plague of white supremacy. Because if we are going to reckon with, as Em said, the racial elements of the carceral state, it seems as though people need to understand that white supremacy is the plague that set that sort of thing in motion 1619 and continues to this day in a different form of the new Jim Crow. And therefore, if we're going to get people to understand that it is in their own best interest to not live in a society where some people get to buy their way out of these problems, and then we have this concentration of suffering and police repression in other places, that's not a civilization that anybody ought to want to live in. And therefore, if we're going to say, you know, look, yes, I don't like paying taxes, but I'd much rather pay taxes to fund a deconstruction of the carceral state, you know, that will ultimately benefit my own community, even though it's not suffering in the way that other communities are suffering. It seems like that, to me, is the best way for us to try to convince the middle that they need to get on board with a big change, while at the same time recognizing that this is a system that is definitely punishing some people more than others, but that we are all tied into the same mindsets. And in order for one of us to be free, we all need to be free. And we need to take that seriously as a life process rather than just like a bumper sticker or a t-shirt.
But it's also, I say this as a white person, it's like among white folks is the problem of working with white folks.
Mm-hmm.
So there's and this is the tension. White supremacy is like really a thing. And there's also like tons of liberal white supremacy. And there's lots of layers and layers and stuff. I don't want to like spend the 3 hours, but there's like layers of this stuff. And what happens is a lot of white folks can get threatened and flip the other way.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that white folks are the majority, right? And so you're trying to figure out, as a white person who's trying to de-racialize the society, trying to figure out, I'm very aware of those dynamics among white people, and you're trying to figure out how to resist them. And that's why I said I think it's important to pay attention. There are people actively trying to inflame those racial tensions to get white people to get mad and to get resentful and to feel like they're afraid of pushing too hard, right? And so there's tons of political work being done on the other side to activate those white resentments. That's what I meant when I said, you know, because I like, there was an active movement after the civil rights movement to to take away the victories of civil rights, right? I mean, that was like an active political process, and you could see the active political process building against Black Lives Matter at its peak. You could see that counter movement working, right? And so that's what I meant by saying that, you know, of course the other side gets more active when they realize they're losing, then they like try to figure out how to push back, right? And so you always have to be paying attention. I think, you know, as a white person paying attention to that other side, like how are you gonna like hold those, resist that, put out a counter rhetoric, put out a counter way of talking that actually actively resists that and doesn't let yourself be pulled over into that rhetoric. And so it's really hard, I think. But I think it's important to talk about race.
So I want to respond to, extend my first comment about the need for disruption. So if there are a spectrum of people and, you know, using this as a spectrum and this is left, like radical, and this is right, as in conservative, white supremacy down here, and then Pam is speaking to this group in the middle who I'll call here moderates, but we could call these people a lot of different things. We call them today moderates. So there is a theory around how you popularize an idea. And the idea is that you would need a massive people to overwhelm either a current existing thought, to have some sort of cultural revolution, or at least, or you would have this massive people be able to disrupt materially so you can have political, economic, etc. changes, social movements. I don't disagree with that. I think that's one way, one part of how we'll achieve the goal. What I'm offering today is how we don't need to join the middle, but how we need to move the middle left, right? And I think that's often what people often concede and join the middle, become more moderate in their thinking as a way to appeal to a mass instead of maintaining an idea and shifting the middle to the left. Now, to the point of disruption about why I'm saying to this room, right, if this is Progressive Dane, and I would say Progressive Dane is left of center, then you have a particular responsibility to move people further left, right? And we have a particular responsibility to hold a political line, a political position, whether or not it is popular. And the act of that is disruptive. Now, whether or not that means you go and sing in the Capitol or you march into the mayor's office, look, I'm for a wide range of tactics, and I think people at this point know that. And I think we need to take particular forms of tactics that are seen as disruptive more serious. And I do think they need to be scientific and calculated and not to take the place of popularizing the building base, etc. But what I am saying is, as a political machine, right, as a political vehicle, as you all are positioning yourself, you need to understand that your role will be disrupted. And the minute that this body sees itself as not being disruptive, you would have become moderate, right? And that doesn't mean your disruption has to be where, I'm not saying you should no longer have a meeting, why aren't you outside in the intersection on the highway? I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is your political positions cannot be moderate, and that will cause disruption. That will make some of the people who seem to appear to be your friends upset. And you need to be okay with that. That will be taking an unpopular position. And you don't do it just for the sake of being antagonistic. You're doing it because you're advancing a particular set of political ideas. So that's really what I'm speaking to about the need to be disruptive. So I think ideologically you have to be okay with that. And in this city, people with incredible thoughts are not okay with being disruptive. They're more concerned with appearing to be mannerable or easy to get along with or easygoing than they are with being, I think, serious about forward-thinking change. And in addition to that, I am saying we should be involved in tactics that are considered disruptive, because we have to force the system to submission of our agenda. And we will not defeat those in power, the corporate, wealthy folks, those with the most political power, by appealing to them morally. We will shift the middle by beginning to make moral appeals to the middle, logical appeals to the middle, our base, our community members. We will not defeat power structures by moral appeals. That's what I'm saying.
All right, well, I think this has been a no 10 minutes.